On the 29th of December 1610, György Thurzó arrived at Čachtice Castle with armed men and placed Elizabeth Bathory under house arrest. She would never leave it again. Within days, proceedings began that would produce Europe's most notorious female monster. But those proceedings contained something worth examining very carefully. Elizabeth Bathory herself was never brought to trial. She never stood before the court that judged her servants. There was no public proceeding in which she could answer the accusations made against her. She was contained, and the case moved forward without her, 650. That number appears in virtually every account of Bathory ever written. Books, documentaries, the Guinness World Records. It is the figure most people repeat. The most prolific female killer in recorded history, they say. 650 women. Here is where that number actually comes from. A servant named Susanna testified that she had heard of a book, a private record allegedly containing the names of Bathory's victims, from a court official named Jakub Silvasi. Silvasi was never brought before the court to confirm that claim. The book was never produced as evidence. It has never been located by any historian. The figures that surviving testimony could actually support were far more contested, and neither 650 nor any other number was ever established through Bathory's own formal legal proceedings. Because those proceedings never happened, the 650 entered the historical record through a single unverified claim, and then stayed there through 4 centuries of repetition. So if the most famous fact about this case can't be verified, what else can't be? That's where this investigation begins. Not with the legend, with what actually survived. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her relatives included military commanders, judges, and men who governed entire provinces. She was educated, fluent in Hungarian, Latin, and German at a time when most women in Europe received no formal instruction at all. At 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, known later as the Black Knight of Hungary, a military commander documented for extreme battlefield violence during the Ottoman Wars. While he campaigned, she managed the estates, the correspondence, the finances, the disputes with tenants and creditors. All of it passed through her. When Ferenc died in 1604, that control became total. Elizabeth Bathory was now the sole administrator of one of the largest landholdings in the kingdom, a widow with no male guardian and no political superior except the crown itself. She was also a creditor. The Habsburg king, Matthias II, owed her a significant personal debt. Money borrowed from her estates and not repaid. That detail will matter. Hold it for now. At Cachtice and her other properties, something had been attracting attention for years before any formal investigation began. One of the earliest surviving complaints against her predates the 1610 proceedings by nearly a decade. It describes accusations of cruelty towards servants, evidence that the story did not simply appear the moment Thurzo decided to move against her. A Lutheran minister named István Magyari raised concerns around 1602, apparently disturbed enough by what he had heard to put it in writing. That complaint matters precisely because of when it appeared. It tells us that whatever was happening at Cachtice had been observed and reported before any political crisis existed, before any debt became inconvenient, before any inheritance was at stake. But it also tells us something the legend rarely mentions. Her noble status created enormous barriers to investigation and prosecution, particularly where the victims were servants. Low-born girls employed in a noble household existed in a legal space that courts rarely entered. Their deaths could go unrecorded for years without anyone in authority demanding an explanation. What changed, what finally triggered a formal investigation, was the allegation that the victims had begun to include young women of noble rank. That was the threshold, not the number, not the duration, the status of the missing. Thurzo's investigation, ordered by King Matthias II, claimed to have gathered testimony from more than 300 witnesses. The count at the first trial, held on January 2nd, 1611, was 13. 13 witnesses appeared and gave sworn testimony before the court. That isn't a clerical error. That's a gap worth understanding. Much of the broader testimony gathered during the investigation was hearsay. People describing what they had heard from servants, neighbours, or others, rather than something they had personally witnessed. The witnesses who did testify directly were almost entirely Bathory's own servants. People whose lives at that moment depended entirely on how they answered. Some of their accounts were consistent. Some contradicted each other. Some shifted between depositions. The record is not clean, and it was never meant to be examined by anyone inclined to look too closely. The second trial, held 5 days later on January the 7th, was conducted in secret, under Thurzo's authority. Parliament was not in session during either proceeding, which meant no external body existed to review what was being said inside that room. It was in this second closed proceeding that Susanna's testimony about the alleged book appeared. She said she had heard of it from Silvasi. Silvasi, sitting in that same legal apparatus, never mentioned the book in his own testimony. The court did not summon him to clarify. The book was not requested. The proceeding moved forward. That is how 650 became a number, not through evidence, through a chain of reported speech that the court accepted without testing the next link. Then something happened that closed the evidentiary record permanently. The servants who had worked closest to Bathory, among the most important surviving first-hand witnesses, were executed within days of the trial's ending. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentes were sentenced to death and executed by burning after having their fingers torn out by the executioner. Janos Ujvari was beheaded and then burned. A fourth servant, Katerina Benica, who claimed she had acted under coercion, received life imprisonment. A woman named Ursi Majarova, described as an associate, was apprehended later and also burned. The law offered a verdict, the fire offered silence. There is no surviving record of any independent investigator cross-examining those witnesses before their executions. By the time anyone outside Thurzo's circle might have questioned them, there was no one left to question. The only people with direct knowledge of what had actually occurred inside Cachtice were gone within weeks of speaking. Their testimony sealed into the record exactly as Thurzo's apparatus had received it, with no mechanism for anyone to challenge what they had said. Now consider who actually controlled this case. György Thurzó was Bathory's cousin by marriage. He had become Palatine of Hungary, the kingdom's highest judicial authority below the king, only months before moving against her. Historians have noted that he acted against her almost immediately upon assuming that office. King Matthias II, who ordered the investigation, was the same king who owed Bathory the unpaid personal debt. Her sons-in-law, according to surviving accounts, were informed of the arrest before it took place, not after, before, and they made no attempt to warn her. The financial arrangements that followed the arrest are documented. The royal debt was cancelled. Bathory's family retained control of her estates rather than surrendering them to state confiscation. Had she been formally convicted and executed, those landholdings would have gone to the crown. Instead, a private arrangement was reached. House arrest managed by the family, debt extinguished, estates preserved. The people controlling this case were not detached from its outcome. Each of them had something specific to gain from exactly the result they produced. That is documented. What it proves is more complicated. It establishes that money and inheritance were sitting inside this case from the beginning. It tells us the investigation was not conducted by parties with nothing at stake. But it does not, by itself, prove that the accusations were manufactured. Motives explain why people act the way they do. They don't automatically determine what the underlying facts were. Because here is where the investigation has to be honest with itself. The complaint from nearly a decade before the arrest still exists. The accusations of cruelty towards servants predate every political motive we've just examined. The minister who wrote them down had no debt to cancel, no estate to inherit, no political rival to neutralise. He wrote what he had heard because he was disturbed by it. The question of whether Elizabeth Bathory harmed anyone cannot be answered with a clean no. The question of whether she harmed 650 people cannot be answered with a clean yes. That gap, between the real and the constructed, is where she has lived for 400 years. After the trials ended, she was returned to Cachtice, not to a dungeon, to her own rooms, but the windows were bricked over. A small slot was cut into the wall for food. She had no legal recourse because there had been no legal verdict, no trial, no conviction, no appeal, no date by which her situation would be reviewed. She wrote letters from inside that room. Some of them survive. In those letters she maintained her innocence and continued discussing the management of her estates, property disputes, financial arrangements, the ordinary business of a noblewoman who expected to resume her life. She appears to have believed she would eventually be released. There is something in those letters, in their practical tone, that makes the silence around them harder to ignore. She was found dead on August the 21st, 1614, face down on the floor of her sealed room. She had been inside it for 4 years. She was 53 years old. Her body was initially buried at Cachtice, but was later moved, and the location of her grave remains disputed to this day. The 650 survived her by centuries. The blood-bathing legend, the claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, wasn't recorded as supposedly factual until more than 100 years after her death. It grew through local folklore, then through 18th century written accounts that treated earlier rumours as established history, then through a Hammer horror film in 1971 that brought the image to mass audiences, then through the internet, where each retelling treated the previous one as a source. A number that began as unverified courtroom hearsay became, through accumulation, an accepted historical fact. Shelley Puhack's 2026 book, The Blood Countess, Murder, Betrayal, and the Making of a Monster has returned to the case using newly examined archival material and explicitly questions what the surviving evidence can actually support. Not to acquit Bathory, but to separate what the record shows from what the legend claims. 4 centuries of investigation have produced the same honest answer. We cannot convict her. We cannot acquit her. And the reason we cannot is itself the story. The institution that imprisoned her also destroyed the evidence that might have judged her, and then the legend filled the space where the verdict should have been. That leaves one question, and I want your answer in the comments. György Thurzó imprisoned Elizabeth Bathory without trial and ensured the key witnesses were gone before any independent party could reach them. But the complaints about Cachtice existed before any of his political motives did. A formal trial, given her rank and resources, might never have produced a conviction, regardless of what she had done. Was Thurzo right, or did the method make it permanently impossible to know the truth?